Today's review and study is on the new rotation topic of Adam and Eve and the implications of the story of Adam and Eve for all of us as people. Now, to put that against the proper backdrop, we want to remember the creation story that begins the Bible. God's making the heavens and the earth and everything in the world in those times we call 6 days. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of detail on the 6 days, except just generically to say that those 6 days may or may not have been the long kinds of period, or the short kinds of periods of time that we look at as days today. They might have been short, they might have been long. We remember the verse from the New Testament letters that says that for God 10,000 years is as a day. And we don't know for sure, and I'm not sure that's really the main concern of Genesis 1. I think what Genesis 1 wants us to know is that God did it and it was good, and that God did it in distinct stages that built upon each other. And for today's purposes, the thing that we need to know most of all is that the making of the human race was the joyful climax of the creation story. That is, for all the vast expanse and beauty and order in the universe, the inanimate universe, if you will, and then all the things that God made that live and breathe, that the greatest accomplishment of creation on earth was the human race. Because God made people with hearts to know, to reflect in a peculiar way the presence and the glory of God. There was a human stamp, if you will, an image that God put. And the image didn't have to do with fingers and toes or color of hair or eyes. It has to do with the human heart and the mind and heart's capacity to know and reflect and project the nature of God. It says God made us in God's image. So, in this progressive stage of creation, here we find the joyful climax of creation, the making of humanity. Now, what we sense in this is that God made humanity for a particular kind of fellowship, carrying an image in our hearts. There's a particular kind of fellowship that we might have and enjoy with God through all time. It seems that it was important to God to make sure that it is because we love His fellowship, which after all is part of the nature of God, to love fellowship and to rejoice in creation and its fruitfulness. And so God, as we understand it, God did not make us as if we were machineries or puppets. We weren't things that would just look like an entity of living beauty and order, but we were rather given the opportunity to choose to love God as God has chosen to make and love us. So that fellowship, that bliss, that life that is God's plan A for the human heart presumes also a desire from within, a voluntariness, if you will, to embrace God in return as God first embraced and made us. So that's the background of the making of the human race, Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve, then, as the prototypes of the human race, are given a beautiful, a harmonious place to live, that Garden of Eden, where things work as we would hope they would work, where things don't break down or destroy or rob the dreams of their hopefulness. And God says, these things are all yours as long as you will acknowledge your limits. And specifically, the limit is that of all the things that you have here to nourish yourselves, leave the boundary piece alone, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you can leave that one thing alone and entrust that to me alone, says God, then you can live in this bliss and fellowship and harmony, and will reflect that joy and that love to each other. So that's the setting in which Adam and later on Eve is made. Adam and Eve together as companions to support and help and guide and nurture one another. In their distinct roles, man and Adam, Eve as woman, complementing each other, without whom neither is quite complete. There's a balance about the genders, that neither single gender alone is enough to understand the personality and nature of God. They complement each other in a fundamental way. Forward they go, in a state of innocence. At the end of Genesis chapter 2, it says, and the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. And that's a signature of innocence. It's hard for us to grasp that innocence unless we've raised a newborn. And when the newborn is old enough to roll around, get up and move and crawl and such, and sometimes leaves the diaper behind, all we can do is chuckle, because there's that innocent, spontaneous joy about them. And that's the spirit, I believe, of what ends in Genesis chapter 2, that there's that spontaneous joy and innocence to go forward without worrying about stuff that we find such an incremental part of our lives today. But they do have that choice. Respect the boundary. Respect that God has drawn a line and said, don't go there, or a different kind of fate awaits you. You'll die. They apparently knew what death was, and they didn't want it. They wanted that eternal bliss of life and fellowship and harmony with God. Now, the core of what happens in the narrative is in Genesis chapter 3. And it starts out saying the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal the Lord God had made. And so the serpent, evidently able to communicate in this blissful and harmonious place, is able to say to the woman, did God say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? Well, she had her instructions right. She said, well, no, we can eat from just about any tree in the garden. There's just one that we can't. As an aside, just let me say, because sometimes in our review and in our learning, sometimes we have thought that the serpent was Satan. Well, Genesis doesn't mention Satan anywhere, so we can't really say that with too much authority. What we can say is that the nature of Satan is to tempt and to slander, and that was what the serpent was doing. So if it matters a whole lot, it's almost a technicality. We don't have any authority from Genesis to talk about the serpent actually being Satan in disguise, because the books of Moses don't mention Satan at all. But in the terms of the spirit of what Satan is all about, sure, it was in harmony with the intention of Satan. In any case, the serpent begins to play with words, put a spin on what God said, reinterpret what Eve said, and end up saying basically to the woman, oh no, you won't die. You'll be all right. And you know what? If you choose to cross that boundary, you'll be like God. You'll know what good and evil are all about. You'll be more like God than you are now. Well, that's a wondrous thought. Something that we all might be tempted to do. Some of our classic stories, whether they're ancient stories from the early civilizations or even science fiction stories that a lot of us grew up with, they have a common theme of someone whose ambition takes them away from their original ideal and has them with a higher ambition of chasing and becoming either God or like a God, far more insightful and powerful than we ever could be if we stayed like we are now. And that is quite the ambitious temptation. So that's dangled before Eve. Now, even if she wasn't that ambitious, we'd have to ask her, if we get to talk to her one day, even if she wasn't, she certainly was tempted by all those other things. It was a delightful thing to look at. It was desired to make one wise. It was there. It was good for food. There were all kinds of things that sold this forbidden fruit anyway, irrespective of the ambitious piece, though I think that's part of the story for their sake and for ours, that we might understand the kinds of things that would take our eyes off the prize and have us chasing something that distracts us and sometimes confuses us about our identity, our relationship with God. So she makes the decision, that fateful decision, and it's a part of the human nature. Draw a boundary, and there's something about human nature that wants to cross the boundary to prove that we can. Sometimes we can be found to do really foolish things just to prove that we can. In fact, sometimes proving that we can do something we're told not to do can become an obsession to us, and we find ourselves doing really foolish things. There's an old story about mom and dad going out and telling the kids as they go, "We're going to be gone for a few hours, we'll be back soon, just don't put any beans in your ears while we're gone." The boys and girls say to each other, "Oh, why would anybody want to do a silly thing like that? But wait, they told us we can't. There must be something about putting beans in our ears that really counts for something. We've got to try that." And pretty soon, mom and dad come home, and there are these silly kids trying to put beans in their ears for no good reason, because it's not comfortable, it's not natural, there's nothing that would make them want to do it except to prove that they can. There's something in human nature about that. Eve, whether it's by ambition or just rationalizing that this is good for you after all, or whether it's out of rebellion, she made a conscious choice to do something that crossed the only boundary in all the world that God had given her. And then she brings it to Adam and shares with him, and he makes a conscious choice to take this thing that he knew was across the boundary. And they have indulged together. It says in Genesis 3 that they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the evening breeze. They realized that they were naked. And all of a sudden they were ashamed. This is one of those flags, one of these signs, these kickers that say something has gone wrong. They have never known shame before. And now they're ashamed. And they have to fix their shame. They have to make these fig leaves, and then when they hear God coming, they have to hide. That wasn't how it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be confidence and fellowship and bliss and harmony. And now they know shame and fear, and they hide. When God walks through the garden in the evening breeze, they're not presenting themselves in friendship. They're hiding and hoping that they won't be found. And God knows something's wrong. He says, "Where are you?" And Adam says, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." The all-wise God picks up the flag right away. "Who told you you were naked? Why does that suddenly matter to you? It didn't matter to you yesterday. Now it matters, and you're ashamed, and you're hiding. What's so different?" And God in perfect wisdom knows that there's only one thing that could be different, because everything else was in harmony. What's different is they made a choice, a conscious choice, to cross the only boundary that God had given them. It wouldn't take God very long. Lord knows in God's perfect wisdom you'd think of this instantly, because we in our partial wisdom can think of it pretty quickly. There's only one thing that could have gone wrong. You crossed the boundary. Did you eat the fruit you were told that you weren't supposed to eat? Now we come to the prototype for one of the greatest skills of fallen human nature. To blame something or somebody else for our own bad choices. Starts with Adam. He could have said, "Well, yes, I did." In fact, if we would go with our conventional understandings of what it means to look out for people that you want to take care of, he could have taken the blame all by himself. But this was no time for chivalry, thought Adam. Instead of saying, yes, that's true, that's what I did, and I'm sorry, he said, well, the woman you gave me talked me into it. God says to Eve, is this true? She says, well, the snake that you have in the garden, he talked me into it. And for the first time in the story, and maybe for all time thereafter, it appears that the snake is speechless. There is so much richness and wisdom in the account of Adam and Eve. It's insightful into human nature. This is how we seem to be. If we can shift the blame, make it somebody else's fault, or maybe even make it the authority's fault. The woman you gave to be with me. It's either his fault, her fault, or it's your fault, God, for making her that way. Nobody seems to have to teach us how to blame shift. It seems to be written in our genes somehow. Everybody seems quickly to learn how to do it, and we don't have to be taught by other people. Which brings us to another piece about this. If we ask one another, why are we so sinful? Why do we have this tendency in us to kick against the boundaries that are given to us? To want to do things our way, whether it's good for us or not, whether it's good for other people or not. We want to do what we want to do. And where does this come from? And if we're asked, the same kind of pattern shows up from a kindergarten classroom all the way to the halls of corporations and government agencies. If someone's caught having done wrong, we have a natural tendency to want to say, I did it, but they made me do it. Or I did it, but you told me something was okay, and it's your fault for misleading me, to shift the blame. And the other piece that comes with that is when we say, why are we like this? There's a natural tendency built into human nature to say, well, we're in this mess in this world, and it's really Adam and Eve's fault. Well, no, it's not. Adam and Eve were first. They made the horrendous mistake that led to the change of trajectory for the human race until they should ever be redeemed. But it's not as if we're messed up because of them. If you or I or any of our peers had been there that day, our nature would have been to do the same thing. And we've got to take responsibility. It's not Adam and Eve's fault. And it's not the devil's fault either. The devil injects temptation into the world. But somewhere along the line, we're going to have to own up to our own responsibility for deciding what to do about temptation. That's the first step in finding our way to redemption and becoming whole again. And so let the precedent be set that Adam and Eve were held responsible for their own decision, just as all of us. No matter how much we can think of influences or guidances or miscues that we might blame our mess of life on, somewhere along the line, we've got to walk our own lonesome valley. So, God says to each of these creatures, well, Adam, because you did this, your life is going to be a lot tougher. You're going to have to work a lot harder, and it won't always be pleasant. The world will be a mixed world, and it'll hurt you sometimes. And he said the same thing to Eve, though in a different form. Your life is going to be a lot tougher than it would have been. There's going to be a lot more pain in it than there would have been. And ultimately, you've lost your immortality. And you're going to have to leave the perfection of Eden and find your way in a mixed world until somehow there will be an opportunity for you to be redeemed. This is where we find ourselves. Paradise is lost. The home that would have been perfect in God's full fellowship is something we can sense. We can look at this world and see some things that are wrong with it and say, it could be better, it should be better, I know what better looks like. There's something in us that has an echo of Eden in it and a longing to get back home there. We know that we're not in Eden. And there's a longing to be whole again, to not be mortal anymore, to be immune to the chaos and brokenness that we see around us and sometimes within us, including the brokenness of justice. All those things are part of where we now live. And yes, we wish we could get home to God. We can't get back. And while we leave paradise, we still have enough of a vision of what it looks like to long for it and to try to find a way back. And there's a beauty about the end of the book of Genesis, of the chapter in Genesis that tells us of Adam and Eve, because God grieves the fall. God grieves the separation because no less are we the climax of God's great creative purpose. We don't fail to be the great joy in which God longs to see a restored and eternal fellowship. God still loves us despite our flagrant faults. We see a sign about that at the end of the story, because even though God is no doubt both heartbroken and angry about all this, God dresses Adam and Eve, and he picks them up, and when they leave the garden never to return to it again in their lifetime, they still can call on the name of the Lord and know that he hears and answers because he has a plan to make them whole. That is the great theme of the whole rest of the Bible, and the great theme of the rest of human lives and the stories of human people in our walk, is that there is a hunger both deeply entrenched in people's hearts on the one hand and in the vision of God on the other to restore this thing that was broken. We're responsible for the brokenness. And then the rest of the Old Testament is a story of a way that God designs to bring people home. It becomes a model and a prototype, not just for Jews and not just for this world, but for all people and for all time. The returning to a homeland that God has prepared, that is Canaan in the times of Israel, is a model for what God really wants to do for the whole human race and for all time, into eternity. To bridge the gap, to redeem the broken, and to bring us to God's side in that restored and perfect harmonious fellowship for all eternity. Hopefully, the story of Adam and Eve and the tragic fall, and the story of attempts to get home through the rest of the Old Testament, will make us hungry that any of us, all of us, can ultimately find the way to be new and healed and restored and in perfect harmony, not just in a mortal world where it's temporary, but in an eternal world where we belong at God's side forever. And that way is Jesus Christ, who paid every price that was left as a debt, and did it not because of his own loss or his own shortcomings, but because he loved us enough to compensate for ours and to bring us back to God's side. That's the ultimate message of the Bible and the message of eternity. It answers the needs of Adam and Eve and you and me and all who have longed to be at home with God again. Let that be our lifetime quest, that we not only experience, but eagerly share with people around us. Amen.